Have you ever watched two people who love each other stop caring? Not all at once, not with a fight, just slowly, quietly, the way a fire goes out when no one feeds it. They still share the same table, the same roof, the same last name, but something is gone. The warmth is gone, the attention is gone, and nobody is doing anything about it. St. John Bosco saw exactly what happens to a marriage when it reaches that point, and what he saw was not pretty. Born on the 16th of August, 1815, in a tiny hillside hamlet called Becci in the Piemontese countryside of northern Italy, Giovanni Melchiorre Bosco came into the world just as one era was slamming shut and another was cranking open. Napoleon had just been defeated. The Industrial Revolution was pulling peasants off their farms and throwing them into factories in places like Turin. Families were being uprooted. Fathers were working 14-hour shifts. Mothers were struggling alone. Children were wandering the streets. And marriages were quietly suffocating under the weight of exhaustion, poverty, and spiritual neglect. Bosco watched this as a boy. He watched it as a young priest. And he understood, with a clarity that few people in history have matched, that the death of a marriage rarely starts with a betrayal. It starts with indifference. It starts with the moment two people stop treating each other as sacred. If you value documented Catholic history and spiritual teaching like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you are hearing this today. And just so you know, this script is researched and factual. The primary sources used here include the biographical memoirs of St. John Bosco, the 19-volume documented record compiled by Father John Baptist Lemoyne, and continued by Fathers Angelo Amade and Eugene Seria between 1898 and 1939, based on direct testimonies from people who lived and worked alongside the saint. The second key source is the Journal of Salesian Studies, specifically the Spring 2004 edition, which published the scholarly analysis of the Dreams of Don Bosco by Father Arthur Lenti, drawing on the full archival record. These are not popular summaries. These are the primary bones of the historical record. Now back to the story. Bosco lost his father when he was barely 2 years old. Francesco Bosco died in 1817, leaving his wife, Margherita Occhiena, to raise 3 boys alone on a farm in a region still scarred by the devastation of the Napoleonic Wars and a killing drought. There was almost nothing to eat. There was even less certainty about tomorrow. Margherita was declared venerable by the church in 2006, a recognition that the holiness she lived in that farmhouse at Becci was not ordinary. She was a woman who had every reason to become bitter and every reason to become cold, and she chose neither. She chose instead to remain warm, to remain attentive, to remain genuinely present to the 3 boys who depended on her for everything. But Margherita never collapsed. She worked the land, fed the children, prayed every single morning, and built a home where faith was not a Sunday performance but a daily breath. John Bosco would later say that everything he knew about how a family should function, he learned from watching his mother. He watched her pray. He watched her love. He watched her refuse to let the hardship of the world turn her cold toward the people she was responsible for. And somewhere in that watching, a young boy formed a conviction that would define his entire adult life. The home is where the soul either grows or dies, and the ones responsible for the home are the ones who either keep feeding it or abandon it. The city of Turin in the 1840s was not the kind of place that was gentle with families. It was a city being torn apart by industrialization in real time. The population of the Valdocco neighborhood, where Bosco would eventually plant his oratory, had swollen with migrants from the Piedmontese countryside. By 1850, Turin's population had nearly doubled from what it had been a generation before, and the slums of Borgodora and Valdocco were packed with people living in conditions that made spiritual life almost impossible in the practical, logistical sense. 12 people to a room, children sharing beds, parents working from before dawn to after dark. No time for mass, no energy for prayer. No space for the quiet that a marriage needs in order to remain a marriage, and not just a shared arrangement for surviving poverty together. By the time Bosco was 9 years old, in 1824, he had his first dream. He saw himself in a field filled with boys who were fighting and cursing. He tried to stop them and got nowhere. Then a figure appeared, luminous and calm, and told him that these boys could not be reached with fists or arguments, only with patience and love. The dream shook him so hard he remembered every detail for the rest of his life. He wrote it down decades later in his Memoirs of the Oratory of St. Francis de Sales, composed between 1815 and 1855 and published posthumously in 1989. He kept dreaming. Throughout his life, dozens of visions came to him. Not the soft, comfortable kind, hard ones. Some took him through hell. Some showed him boys falling off cliffs while their parents looked the other way. Some showed him the spiritual state of souls who had abandoned their responsibilities. Each dream carried the same message underneath, no matter how different the imagery. Neglect is not neutral. When you stop caring for what God has placed in your hands, something dies, and the death is real. Bosco entered the seminary at Chieri in 1835. 6 years later, on the eve of Trinity Sunday in 1841, Archbishop Franzoni of Turin ordained him a priest. He was 25 years old. He stepped into Turin like a man who had been waiting his whole life for the fight. Turin in 1841 was a city in crisis. The Industrial Revolution had arrived in Piedmont, and it had arrived hard. Factories were multiplying. The rural poor were flooding into the city looking for work. Entire neighborhoods of Valdaco were packed with families that had been ripped out of their villages and dropped into urban poverty with no support network, no community, and no spiritual structure. Marriages were under siege, not from dramatic affairs or violent confrontations, but from something quieter and more dangerous. The creeping coldness that comes when two people are too exhausted, too stressed, and too disconnected from God to keep showing up for each other. Bosco visited the prisons early in his ministry. What he saw there broke him open. He found boys between 12 and 18, dozens of them crammed into cells, headed toward nothing good. One visit in particular, in the winter of 1841, just weeks after his ordination, changed the direction of his entire life. He walked through a Turin jail with his mentor, the future Saint Father Joseph Cafasso, who ministered regularly to the condemned, and he counted the faces. Young faces, boys who should have been apprentices or students or farmhands, boys with no trade, no faith, no one waiting for them. He asked one of them, "Where is your family?" The boy looked at him without expression and said something that Bosco recorded in his own memoirs of the oratory. The boy said, "I have a mother and a father. They are home. They do not know I am here." And when he looked carefully at the lives those boys had come from, he saw the same pattern repeated over and over again. Not monsters for parents, just people who had stopped paying attention. Fathers who came home from the factory and disappeared into silence. Mothers who had given up expecting warmth and had built walls around themselves instead. Homes where nobody prayed together anymore, where nobody sat together at the table and talked, where children learned from the air around them that love was something that fades, that marriage was something to endure, that God was something other people believed in. Bosco understood this at a biological level, not just a theological one. He knew that children become what they see. And what these children saw, day after day in their homes, was a marriage in a coma, two people coexisting without communion, two people who had stopped being interested in each other's inner world, two people who had exchanged the fire of their early love for the long, cold quiet of habit and resignation. He began talking about this publicly and directly in ways that shocked some of his colleagues. He did not speak about dramatic sins. He spoke about small abandonments. He would say with complete seriousness that the greatest danger to a marriage is not the spectacular failure. It is the ordinary drift. The husband who stops asking his wife how she is and means it. The wife who stops praying for her husband. The couple who stopped going to Mass together not because of a fight, but just because it became inconvenient, and then became normal not to go, and then became forgotten entirely. Bosco called this spiritual indifference. He treated it as a slow poison that could kill a marriage just as effectively as a knife, just more quietly and over a longer period of time. The thing that made it especially dangerous, he said, was that it was invisible. You could not point to the moment it started. You could not name the day the warmth disappeared. It just one morning was no longer there, and neither person could remember when it had left. In the spring of 1851, Bosco gathered a group of the men who worked with him at the oratory of St. Francis de Sales in Valdaco and spoke to them at length about what he called the 3 stages by which a family loses God. His account of this talk was recorded by Father Lemoyne and preserved in the Biographical Memoirs, Volume 4. Lemoyne was meticulous. He interviewed witnesses, cross-referenced accounts, and built the record from direct memory. So when he writes that Bosco said something, it is not a paraphrase passed through 3 generations of oral tradition. It is close to the source. The first stage, Bosco said, was when prayer disappears from the home. Not dramatically, just quietly. The family stops praying together at meals. The rosary stops being said in the evenings. The children stop being taught to pray before sleep. And nobody announces this change. It just happens. One night someone is tired and skips it. And it gets skipped for a week. Then it is simply gone. The second stage, he said, was when the sacraments stopped being received. The couple stops going to confession. They stop receiving communion with any regularity. They still show up at Mass sometimes, but they are spectators now, not participants. They are physically present, but spiritually absent. And this matters enormously, Bosco said, because the sacrament of marriage is not a one-time event. It is a living thing. It has to be fed. And the food it needs is not romantic gestures. It is grace. The specific grace that comes through the sacraments. When a married couple stops going to confession, stops receiving communion, stops praying together, they are not just neglecting their spiritual lives as individuals. They are starving the sacrament that holds their marriage together at the deepest level. The third stage, Bosco said, was when the couple stops seeing each other as sacred, not when they start hating each other. Before that, when they stop looking at each other with wonder. when the other person becomes simply a fixture, a piece of furniture in the architecture of daily life, when the husband looks at his wife and sees only the tasks she performs, and the wife looks at her husband and sees only the problems he creates, when both of them have forgotten, completely and without drama, that this person in front of them is a child of God, an immortal soul, someone for whom Christ died. At that point, Bosco said, the marriage is already in serious spiritual danger. The couple may not know it, the neighbors may not know it, the priest may not know it, but the soul knows it. And then he said something that the men listening remembered for the rest of their lives. He said that when a marriage reaches this third stage, the children in that home begin to feel it in their bodies before they can name it in words. They feel the coldness, they feel the absence. They feel that something essential is missing, but they do not have the language for it. And what they feel, he said, creates a wound that they carry into their own adult lives and eventually into their own marriages. The spiritual neglect of one generation becomes the starting point of the next generation. The indifference is inherited, not through genetics, through the atmosphere of the home. This was not a new theological idea. The Council of Trent had already affirmed in 1547 that marriage is a sacrament, one of the precise seven. Augustine of Hippo had written about the goods of marriage in the year 401, naming fidelity, offspring, and sacrament as the three pillars. But Bosco translated these theological truths into practical, pastoral language that ordinary people in a 19th century Turin factory slum could actually use. He did not speak in Latin, he spoke in the language of the street. He told it like a man at a bar who had seen what happens to the children whose parents stopped caring for the thing they promised to care for. In 1853, Bosco had a dream that he described in detail to the community at Valdocco. It was among the most disturbing of all the visions recorded in the biographical memoirs. He saw a long field, and walking along it were many families. Some of them were walking close together, talking, their children between them, their faces turned toward a distant light. But others were walking apart, the husband far ahead, the wife lagging behind, the children scattered between them and confused. And as Bosco watched, he saw that the families walking apart were gradually drifting toward the edge of a cliff that ran along one side of the field. They did not see the cliff because they were not looking up. They were looking at the ground, watching their own feet, consumed by their private exhaustion and resentment. And one by one, the children of those separated families fell, not because they were bad children, not because they were weak, but because no one was holding their hand. Bosco woke from that dream shaking. He wrote it down. He shared it with anyone who would listen. He said the dream was not metaphorical. It was a description of what he was seeing in real life every time he visited a Turin prison and asked a young man in a cell how he had ended up there. The preventive system was Bosco's answer to all of this. He laid it out formally in his written work, The Preventive System in the Education of the Youth, published in 1877. The system had three pillars: reason, religion, and loving kindness. But what most people who study the preventive system miss is that Bosco designed it not just as a method for educating street boys. He designed it as a description of how a healthy family should function. Reason meant explaining things to children rather than simply demanding obedience. Religion meant making God a real presence in the daily life of the home, not a weekly obligation. And loving kindness meant never letting a child doubt that he or she was seen, valued, and wanted. All three of those pillars had to be present in the marriage first, before they could be present in the parenting. You cannot give your children what you have not built between yourself and your spouse. You cannot teach your children to reason carefully and with charity if you and your spouse have stopped reasoning with each other at all. You cannot bring God into the lives of your children if you and your spouse have quietly agreed to leave God out of yours. You cannot give your children the experience of being loved unconditionally if the love between you and your spouse has cooled to a polite tolerance. Bosco said this plainly and repeatedly in his conversations recorded by Lemoyne. He said that the two most powerful forces in a child's spiritual formation are the visible faith of the mother and the visible tenderness of the father, not their words. Their visible life, what the children could see happening between their parents every single day. A mother who prays and whose children see her praying gives those children an image of God that no catechism class can produce. A father who speaks to his wife with gentleness, who asks about her day and actually listens to the answer, who holds her hand at Mass, who visibly honors the woman he married, gives his sons a model for how men treat the people they love, and gives his daughters a standard that will shape every relationship they enter for the rest of their lives. And conversely, a mother who has given up on her marriage and wears her resignation like a coat, a father who has stopped being interested in anyone in the house, a couple who interact only through logistics and grievances. These parents are teaching their children something too. They are teaching them that love ends, that marriage is a trap, that God, if he exists at all, is not actually present in the ordinary moments of family life, that faith is for emergencies and holidays, not for Tuesday mornings in a cold kitchen. Now back to the information. If this kind of deep historical and spiritual content is meaningful to you, subscribe. We go this far into the sources every single time. Tell us in the comments what city you are watching from. By 1859, Bosco had founded the Salesians, formally, with Pope Pius IX's approval. He had gathered 17 men, including several whom he had personally raised from boyhood, and built the nucleus of a religious congregation that would spread to 250 houses across the world by the time he died on the 31st of January, 1888. The congregation was built around the same conviction that he had preached at kitchen tables and in prison cells for decades, that the spiritual formation of the young begins at home, and the home either holds together or falls apart based on the spiritual condition of the marriage at its center. In his later years, Bosco became increasingly specific about what he considered the most dangerous threat to Christian marriage in the modern world. He lived through an Italy convulsed by political revolution, the Risorgimento, the violent unification movement that stripped the Pope of his temporal lands and pushed the Catholic Church into a defensive crouch. Anti-clerical governments were shutting down religious schools, seizing church property, and flooding public discourse with the argument that religion was superstition for the ignorant, and that modern people did not need sacraments or priests or God to build good lives and strong families. Bosco watched this and said, wait, give it a generation, give it two. Let the first generation of families grow up without faith in the home and see what their children look like. Let the second generation grow up in marriages where God has been officially declared irrelevant and see what those families produce. He did not say this as a political argument. He said it as a pastoral observation. He had already seen what families without spiritual structure looked like from the inside. He saw them every day in the faces of the boys who came to his oratory. Boys who had grown up in homes where nobody prayed and nobody loved and nobody believed that the marriage at the center of the family was anything more than a social arrangement to be tolerated until death made it unnecessary. Among the testimonies preserved in the biographical memoirs is an account from 1862, recorded by Lemoyne, based on the recollection of Father Michael Rua, Bosco's closest collaborator, and the man who would succeed him as rector major of the Salesians in 1888. Rua remembered Bosco saying, one afternoon in the courtyard at Valdocco, that he had that day spoken with a man from the Borgo d'Ora neighborhood of Turin, whose marriage had reached what Bosco called the stage of cold water. The man had come to Bosco not because his wife had done anything wrong, not because there was another person involved, not because there was violence or addiction or financial ruin. He came because he had realized, sitting at the table one evening, while his wife washed the dishes and his children played silently in the next room, that he felt absolutely nothing. Not anger, not love, not sadness, nothing. He looked at his wife of 14 years and felt as much connection to her as he would to a chair. He was terrified by the nothing. He had expected to feel angry or guilty or relieved when he finally admitted it to himself. Instead, there was just this flat, cold silence inside him where something warm had once been, and he did not know when it had gone. He did not know if it had gone suddenly or slowly, or whether it had never really been as strong as he had imagined in the beginning. Bosco listened to him for a long time. Then he asked one question. He asked, "When did you stop praying for her?" The man did not answer immediately. He sat with the question, and then he said, "Maybe 3 years ago, maybe 4. Bosco did not scold him. He did not give him a speech about the sanctity of marriage or the gravity of the sacrament. He told him something far more practical. He told him to go home that evening and, before he did anything else, to say one prayer. Just one, not a long one. A single prayer, spoken slowly and meant, asking God to let him see his wife the way God sees her. To let him look at the woman who had said yes to spending her life with him and see her for what she actually was, not what the years of exhaustion and habit and inattention had reduced her to in his imagination. That was all. One prayer. Tonight. Do that first." The man came back 2 weeks later. Rua remembered Bosco, telling the story with a kind of quiet intensity that made everyone around him fall silent. The man came back and said, "I looked at her, really looked at her, and I remembered that she was afraid too, that she had given up things she had dreamed about to be his wife, that she carried things alone that she never talked about because she did not want to add to his burden, that she had been faithful through years when he had given her almost nothing to be faithful to. And he felt, for the first time in what felt like forever, something that was not quite love yet but was moving in that direction, something small and warm, like the first ember of a fire that had almost gone completely out." Bosco said, this was not a miracle. This was simply what happens when a person stops treating their spouse as scenery and starts treating them as a soul. The soul does not need grand gestures. The soul needs to be seen. This was the center of everything Bosco taught about marriage. Not the wedding, not the vows, though those mattered enormously. The daily seeing, the daily choice to look at the person you married and treat them as someone worth paying attention to. The daily prayer for them, not the general kind, but the specific kind. God, let me see her clearly today. God, help me be worth something to him today. God, remind me why I chose this person and why they were worth choosing. He told his Salesians repeatedly that the greatest weapon against marital indifference was intercessory prayer. Not couples praying together, though that was powerful too. Individual prayer, said secretly, for the specific well-being of the other person. A husband praying for his wife when she does not know he is praying for her. A wife praying for her husband when he has been difficult and withdrawn and given her every reason to stop caring. This kind of prayer, Bosco said, does two things simultaneously. It asks God to work in the other person, and it changes the person praying, because you cannot genuinely pray for someone and maintain contempt for them at the same time. The act of prayer is itself a form of love, even when the feeling of love has gone cold. He connected this directly to the sacramental theology of marriage as it had been defined at Trent and as he had learned it during his 6 years at the seminary in Chieri. The sacrament of matrimony, unlike the other sacraments, is not administered once and then received passively. The couple administers it to each other. They are the ministers of this sacrament, and that means the grace of the sacrament is not something deposited in them at the altar on the day of the wedding and then available to draw on indefinitely regardless of what they do. The grace of the sacrament has to be renewed. It is renewed through the other sacraments, through confession and communion and prayer, but it is also renewed through the daily acts of married love, through the daily choice to pay attention, through the daily choice to not be indifferent. Among the boys Bosco formed at the oratory was Dominic Savio, who entered in 1854 at the age of 12 and died in 1857 at 15, and who was canonized by Pope Pius XII in 1954. Bosco wrote Savio's biography himself. What is less often noted is that Bosco used Dominic as a living example to every boy at Valdoco of what it looks like to treat the people around you as sacred. Every act of charity, every small sacrifice, every moment of genuine attention that Dominic offered to the other boys was something Bosco pointed to and said, "This is what love looks like in practice. This is what you carry into your future family." Not a feeling, a habit, a discipline of seeing other people clearly and responding to what you see. Bosco was not naive about how hard this was. He had watched his own mother do it alone without a partner in conditions of real poverty and real grief. He knew what it cost to keep showing up for the people you love when everything in your circumstances is telling you to shut down and protect yourself. He did not pretend the work was easy. He only insisted that it was possible and that it was worth it. And that the alternative was catastrophic, not just for the couple, but for every child in the house and every person those children would eventually touch. In 1872, Bosco founded the Daughters of Mary Help of Christians, the female branch of his Salesian family, under the co-direction of Maria Domenica Mazzarello, a young woman from Mornese who was canonized in 1951. The congregation was designed specifically to work with girls and young women, to give them what the boys at Valdoco were getting, a vision of themselves as sacred, as worthy of love, as capable of building something real and good with their lives. He wanted girls to grow up knowing what healthy love looked like so they could either build it in their own marriages or recognize its absence before it was too late. He said in conversations recorded by the early daughters and preserved in their archives that a young woman who has seen genuine love, who has been treated as genuinely valuable, is almost impossible to manipulate or abuse. And a young man who has learned to treat women with real respect, not performance respect, but genuine care, is a man who will one day be capable of the kind of marriage that actually lasts. The last years of Bosco's life were hard ones physically. He went nearly blind. His legs gave out. By 1886, he was being carried from room to room, but he kept working. He kept meeting people. He kept asking questions about their families. And he kept saying the same things he had always said, because the problems he saw in 1841 when he first arrived in Turin were still the same problems in 1888, just louder and more widespread. He died on the 31st of January, 1888, at 2 a.m, in his room at Valdoco. He was 72 years old. Thousands came to his funeral. Pope Pius XI, who had known Bosco personally and called him a giant of sanctity, beatified him on the 2nd of June, 1929, and canonized him on Easter Sunday, the 1st of April, 1934. His body is incorrupt. It rests in the Basilica of Mary Help of Christians in Turin. The Salesian congregation he founded now operates in 132 countries. But the message he spent his entire life delivering was not about congregations or buildings or canonizations. It was about something much smaller and much more permanent. It was about two people in a kitchen or bedroom or a car or a field. Two people who made a promise in front of God in a room full of witnesses. Two people who are now years into that promise and who have, in the ordinary way of things, let the fire get low. He saw, with the precision of someone who had spent 50 years watching what happens to children when marriages fail, exactly what is at stake when two people decide it is easier to be indifferent than to keep paying attention. He saw it in the biographical memoirs he left behind. He saw it in the dreams that woke him shaking in the early hours of Turin mornings. He saw it in every boy who sat in a prison cell in 1842 and could not tell John Bosco the last time anyone in his home had looked at him like he mattered. The real question is not what happens to a marriage when no one cares anymore. The real question is what you do the moment you realize the caring has stopped, because it is never too late to say one prayer. Tonight, slowly, meaning it. Go home. Look at them. Actually look. And here is what the historical record adds at the end quietly. When the Salesian archivist, Father Eugenio Teria, completed volume 19 of the biographical memoirs in 1939, covering the canonization process from 1888 to 1934. He included among the supporting testimonies a letter from a Turin woman identified only by initials, submitted during the beatification inquiry of 1914. She wrote that in 1871 she had come to Don Bosco in despair about her marriage, and he had told her to pray one specific prayer for her husband every night for 30 days without telling the husband she was doing it. She followed his instruction. On the 28th day, her husband, without any conversation or confrontation, asked her if he could join her for Mass the following morning. He did not know she had been praying for him for 27 days. He simply felt, without being able to explain it, that something had changed in the house, that the air was different, that she was looking at him differently. And he wanted, for the first time in years, to go somewhere with her. He joined her the next morning. They went to confession that same day. They received communion together for the first time in 9 years. The letter ends there. No dramatic resolution, no summary. Just two people in a church in Turin in the autumn of 1871, side by side, after 9 years of cold silence, receiving the same bread. That is what Don Bosco saw. That is what he spent his life trying to make possible. One prayer. 27 days, the air in the house changes, and the fire, small and uncertain, begins again.